The Bank for International Settlements, or BIS, was established in 1930, ostensibly to handle German World War I reparations, but it quickly evolved into something far greater. Often called the Bank for Central Banks, the BIS sits in Basel, Switzerland, above the fray of national politics, literally above the law, with special extraterritorial status for its headquarters. During World War II, this institution infamously did business with all sides. Under President Thomas McKittrick, the BIS accepted looted Nazi gold and facilitated foreign exchange for Hitler's Reichsbank. Emil Puhl, a Nazi bank official later convicted of war crimes, even called the BIS the Reichsbank's only foreign branch. Darkly ironic, the BIS justified these dealings as neutral central banking, even as it legitimized Nazi annexations and the pillage of Jewish assets. Despite outrage at its wartime conduct, the BIS emerged from World War II unscathed and stronger. In 1944 at Bretton Woods, Allied leaders, notably U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, passed a resolution to dissolve the BIS at the earliest possible moment. Yet powerful bankers and officials like the Dulles brothers shielded the BIS, arguing its preservation was vital for post-war finance and a bulwark against the Soviets. The BIS even returned Nazi gold, a tacit admission of its wartime role, and quietly carried on. Today it's richer and more untouchable than ever, recently boasting a tax-free profit of $1.36 billion, with a mere 140 elite customers, the world's central banks. This club of central bankers operates in deep secrecy. BIS meetings and committees shape global financial rules behind closed doors. Its Basel Tower hosts hush-hush bi-monthly gatherings of top central bankers and IMF officials, a Basel process where global monetary policies and banking regulations like the Basel III Accords are forged with minimal public scrutiny. In effect, the BIS coordinates the puppeteers of finance, towering over nations in influence much like its sleek circular tower looms over Basel's skyline. The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, was created after World War II, alongside the World Bank, as part of the new global financial order. Charged with stabilizing exchange rates and lending to countries in crisis, it quickly became the ER of international economics, arriving when nations are flat on their backs. But the treatment it prescribes often feels like economic chemotherapy, harsh austerity, and structural adjustments that can ravage the patient. The IMF's governance tilts heavily toward its biggest donors. Wealthier global North countries hold the most voting power, giving the U.S. an effective veto on major decisions. 7 small countries combined have 36 times less IMF voting power than the U.S. Not exactly one country, one vote, and it shows. Policies often align suspiciously with Western interests, leading critics to dub the IMF a tool of U.S. foreign policy. Indeed, Washington has resisted reforms to give emerging economies like China a voice commensurate with their GDP, preferring to keep this global lender as its economic lever. When a nation's economy nosedives, the IMF swoops in with a bailout package, strings firmly attached. In exchange for loans to meet immediate cash needs, borrowing countries must accept stringent conditions: cutting public spending, liberalizing trade, privatizing state industries, and generally opening up their economies, often for the benefit of foreign investors eyeing bargain assets. The fund defends these as necessary bitter pills to restore stability. But for citizens on the ground, IMF medicine can taste like poison. Education and health budgets get axed, food and fuel subsidies vanish, currencies devalue, making daily life more expensive. An IMF program can feel like a form of economic shock therapy, administered by an unaccountable doctor. Crises that lead nations to the IMF's door are sometimes natural market cycles, but other times they look strangely orchestrated. Throughout the Cold War and beyond, there's a trail of evidence suggesting that powerful governments and intelligence agencies have covertly undermined target economies, only to have Western-controlled institutions step in afterward. Consider Chile in the early 1970s. President Salvador Allende embarked on socialist reforms, nationalizing resources and defying U.S. business interests. The U.S. response was a clandestine campaign to make the economy scream, as President Nixon bluntly ordered. Declassified discussions show U.S. officials agreed they must do everything we can to hurt Allende and bring him down, deliberately destabilizing Chile's finances and society. This covert economic warfare created the conditions, in Henry Kissinger's words, for the 1973 military coup that ousted Allende. After the coup, General Pinochet's new regime eagerly embraced free market shock therapy advised by Western economists, and institutions like the World Bank and IMF were more than happy to help remake Chile's economy along capitalist lines. In a dark irony, a manufactured crisis achieved in months what open diplomacy could not, delivering a nation from socialist experiment into the hands of the global market system. Chile is just one example. Similar patterns emerged elsewhere in Latin America and the developing world. A leader veers out of Washington's orbit, economic troubles suddenly multiply, and eventually an IMF or World Bank program comes to rescue the country at the price of aligning its policies with the Western playbook. In the 1980s, many Latin American and African states drowned in debt after a sudden spike in global interest rates, triggered by the U.S. Federal Reserve's fight against inflation. Those higher rates weren't aimed at them, but the effect was the same as a financial weapon. Interest payments ballooned overnight, pushing dozens of countries into default. Mexico in 1982, Brazil, Argentina, Nigeria, one by one, they ran out of cash. Western banks that had lent freely in the 1970s now faced massive losses, so they turned to the IMF and BIS to coordinate a response. The solution was telling debtor nations got new loans from the IMF and emergency credit from the BIS, only if they agreed to strict austerity and to repay the Western banks in full. In essence, private banks' reckless loans were bailed out. The public and debtor countries paid the price through years of belt-tightening. An African editor summarized it bluntly: "It's not right for a bank to run the whole world. What this means in practice is that the United States runs our countries under the IMF's guise. There is even a term, IMF riot, for the social unrest that erupts after the IMF's prescribed shock therapy hits home. From Peru to Zambia, Indonesia to Jordan, citizens have taken to the streets when food prices spiked or jobs vanished as a result of IMF-mandated measures. This cycle destabilization, intervention, unrest can leave lasting scars on a nation's psyche. It also raises uncomfortable questions. Were some of these economic disasters accidental or calculated moves in a high-stakes game of global chess? Skeptics point to cases like Iran in the early 1950s, where US and UK sanctions and boycotts preceded a coup, or more recently the Asian financial crisis in 1997, where nations like Malaysia accused speculative investors of deliberately attacking their currencies. While hard proof of conspiracy is elusive, the outcomes consistently empowered Western financial institutions. At minimum, the IMF has often acted less like an impartial nurse responding to an unforeseeable accident, and more like a savvy ambulance chaser, arriving at just the right moment to direct the treatment in a way that advances the interests of its most powerful members. Romania's tumultuous economic history provides a vivid microcosm of these dynamics. During the communist era under Nicolae Ceausescu, Romania eagerly borrowed from Western creditors in the 1970s to industrialize. But when the early 80s debt crisis struck, Romania was hit hard. Global interest rates soared, and by 1981 Romania could no longer pay its debt. Ceausescu, a Stalinist strongman with a maverick streak, initially turned to the IMF for help. In 1981, with reserves nearly exhausted, Romania negotiated an IMF agreement and some debt rescheduling. The IMF's conditions, however, were severe, and Ceausescu bristled at the loss of hard sovereignty they implied. He watched what was happening next door in Poland, where an IMF program forced the communist government to halve investments, free prices, and cede economic control, a nightmare scenario for any hardline regime. Determined not to let foreign bankers dictate Romania's policies, Ceausescu made a drastic choice. He banished the IMF and ordered every last dollar of Romania's foreign debt to be repaid, years ahead of schedule. To accomplish this, the Romanian state imposed one of the most punishing austerity programs in modern history. Through the mid-1980s, Romania exported everything it could: food, fuel, machinery, to earn hard currency for debt repayment. Imports, including basic consumer goods and medical supplies, were slashed to the bone. The regime even rationed bread, electricity, and heat for its population in a bid to save money. Living standards plummeted. By the late 80s, Romanians were enduring cold, dark apartments and empty grocery shelves while the government boasted of its shrinking debt. Ceausescu did succeed in paying off the external debt by 1989, a $12 billion feat, but at the cost of a system crisis that brought the economy to the brink of implosion. Many observers believe this extreme austerity alienated the public and eroded the regime's legitimacy, contributing directly to Ceausescu's violent overthrow in the December 1989 revolution. In a final irony, the dictator's attempt to free Romania from foreign debt ended with the country in chaos, and its new leaders rushing back into the arms of the IMF. Throughout the 1990s, as Romania transitioned to capitalism, the IMF and World Bank became frequent visitors in Bucharest. Romania's economy, unbalanced by decades of centralized planning and the recent trauma, struggled badly. The early transition years saw hyperinflation and a 40% GDP collapse as price controls were lifted and uncompetitive industries crumbled. Western advisors prescribed shock therapy, rapid privatization, and liberalization, but Romania opted for a somewhat slower approach than Poland or Russia. Even so, successive Romanian governments inked multiple agreements with the IMF to stabilize the currency and get budget support. Each came with conditions cutting subsidies to loss-making factories, leading to layoffs, freezing wages in the public sector, introducing new taxes and selling off state enterprises to private, often foreign, owners. By the late 90s, corruption and political instability made things worse, and another IMF rescue was needed in 1999. Ordinary Romanians experienced this era as a whiplash between recessions and feeble recoveries. Unemployment and poverty spiked, and millions eventually emigrated in search of work, a brain drain that still hinders Romania. Critics argue that the IMF-backed reforms prioritized Romania's ability to service debt and integrate into global markets over the well-being of its people. In essence, the country regained creditworthiness while many citizens lost their livelihoods. The cycle repeated in 2009 when the global financial crisis swept Eastern Europe. Romania, by then an EU member, had enjoyed a mid-2000s credit boom, foreign banks eagerly lending to Romanians, and then suddenly faced a severe recession. The IMF, European Union, and World Bank assembled a €20 billion rescue package in 2009 to prevent a currency collapse. The terms were familiar: curb the deficit at all costs. In July 2010, Romania's government, with encouragement from IMF advisors, cut public wages by 25%, axed thousands of state jobs, raised the value-added tax from 19% to 24%, and slashed various social benefits. This shock program was devastating for ordinary households. Imagine losing a quarter of your income overnight in the middle of a recession. Not surprisingly, domestic consumption cratered, and the economy contracted further in the short term. The austerity measures were so severe that even the IMF's own evaluators later acknowledged they might have overshot. Yet by 2011, Romania was back to satisfying international lenders and even restoring some of the wage cuts. The economy eventually returned to growth, but the social toll was heavy and lasting. Higher inequality, crumbling public services, and a populace deeply distrustful of its leaders' insistence that we had no choice but to obey the IMF's dictates. Romania's story typifies the bind many nations find themselves in. Damned if you default, damned if you comply. Sovereignty becomes a bargaining chip in deals struck to avert immediate disaster, with long-run consequences left for future generations. After decades of loan programs across the globe, the track record of the IMF is at best mixed, and often downright dismal. While IMF officials tout success stories and crises averted, many borrower nations emerged from IMF tutelage economically weaker, socially fractured, and more dependent than before. A comprehensive study of 81 developing countries from 1986 to 2016 showed that IMF-imposed structural reforms often increased poverty and trapped countries in cycles of underdevelopment. In Africa, the 1980s IMF structural adjustment programs coincided with what's bluntly called the lost decade for development. Governments, under IMF pressure, cut spending on education by an average of 25% and on healthcare by 50%. The predictable result? School enrollments fell, hospitals deteriorated, and diseases spread. It's estimated that these policies contributed to 500,000 excess child deaths in sub-Saharan Africa as vital health services were scaled back to satisfy foreign creditors. Far from lifting countries out of hardship, the IMF's austerity often pushed them deeper into desperation, a bitter parody of saving a country by destroying its social fabric. Look at Argentina, a poster child of IMF orthodoxy gone wrong. In the 1990s, Argentina faithfully followed the IMF playbook. It privatized state industries, pegged its currency to the dollar, slashed public spending, raised taxes, you name it. For a brief moment, things looked rosy to foreign investors, but soon the house of cards collapsed. Massive capital flight ensued, and the country spiraled into depression. By 2001, Argentina defaulted on its debt in a monumental financial crash that saw GDP plummet and middle-class savers lose their life savings. Decades later, Argentina still struggles. The early 90s hyperinflation and the subsequent implosion wiped out so much wealth that even today 1 in 3 Argentinians lives below the poverty line. The lasting impacts of IMF structural adjustment are painfully visible in Argentina's persistent economic fragility and debt renegotiations. As one analysis put it, the IMF set up a system where poor countries stay poor, a treadmill of debt and austerity that keeps nations coming back to the fund, cap in hand. Even when IMF medicine achieves technical stability, it can be a Pyrrhic victory. The case of Greece is illustrative. After the 2010 Eurozone crisis, Greece received IMF-EU bailout packages that came with draconian austerity conditions. The result? Greece's economy shrank by 25%, unemployment soared above 27%, and an entire generation was plunged into misery. Wages and pensions were slashed, taxes hiked. Greek society went through a grinder to earn the loans that mostly went to repaying European banks, and after all that, the country's debt burden increased, from 130% to 180% of GDP. The ultimate insult, the IMF later admitted mistakes were made in the Greek program design. For the Greek people, those mistakes meant homelessness, suicide spikes, and youth fleeing abroad in droves. It's a stark reminder that what IMF officials call reform can feel to the local population like a slow-motion loss of economic sovereignty and dignity. From Jamaica to Zambia, Pakistan to Ukraine, the refrain is similar. Initial IMF loans come amid crisis with promises of a turnaround. In some cases there is a short-lived boost, the currency stabilizes, inflation dips. But then, the side effects kick in, rising inequality, higher unemployment, and crucially, a debt load often higher than the one that started the whole cycle. Countries frequently end up in what critics term a debt trap, having to borrow anew just to pay past debts, a form of debt peonage on a national scale. A vicious cycle ensues, more loans, more conditions, less sovereignty. Governments start tailoring policies to please IMF technocrats rather than their own citizens. Democratic accountability suffers when an elected leader can say, sorry, the IMF is making us do this. In the worst cases, countries essentially cede economic policy making to IMF officials, who sit in ministries as de facto overseers. Is this assistance or a new form of colonial dominance? As the Zambian journalist Fred Mumembe observed, under IMF regimes, the United States runs our countries. The flag flying over the presidential palace may be local, but the tune being played is often composed in Washington. One of the gravest long-term consequences of repeated IMF interventions is the erosion of national sovereignty. This isn't sovereignty in the abstract, but very tangible control over a country's own destiny, its policies, resources, and priorities. Each round of IMF conditions chips away at the government's autonomy to make decisions in the best interest of its people. Want to subsidize local farmers to ensure food security? Sorry, that's market distortion. Cut it. Thinking of raising public sector salaries to a living wage? Off the table. Balance that budget. Even the choice to invest in certain industries can be constrained by IMF-imposed frameworks. Over years, these limitations accumulate into a form of external control. History offers cautionary tales. Jamaica, after decades of on-and-off IMF programs starting in the 1970s, saw entire sectors like dairy and agriculture wither under competition from cheap imports once it removed tariffs per IMF advice. The country became more dependent on imported food and more vulnerable to price shocks. Local farmers effectively lost their livelihoods, and Jamaica lost a piece of its economic independence, reliant on foreign supply for basics it used to grow. Ghana, another frequent IMF client, liberalized and privatized many public services. Today, foreign companies own significant stakes in its mining, telecoms, and banking sectors. While investment is not inherently bad, the fire sale privatizations often pushed by IMF deals mean national assets end up in multinational hands at knockdown prices. Citizens wake up to find the mines under their soil or the utilities in their cities are no longer theirs in any sense. This is sovereignty for sale. And the price was set by loan conditions drafted an ocean away. In some instances, the loss of sovereignty is almost literal. During the European debt crisis, Greece and Italy were pressured by the EU-IMF Troika to install unelected technocrats to lead their governments when elected leaders faltered in implementing austerity. In 2011, Greece's prime minister was essentially forced out and replaced by a former central banker, a vice chairman of BIS no less, to ensure compliance with bailout terms. Italy saw a similar technocratic takeover with Mario Monti's appointment. While not orchestrated by the CIA or some cloak-and-dagger operation, it demonstrated how financial overlords can effectively nullify democratic outcomes under the mantra, "Markets must be appeased." When a nation's economic policies are dictated by IMF staff or bond markets dictates, the line between independence and financial vassalage grows thin. Sovereignty is seated not in one dramatic treaty, but in dozens of small technocratic agreements, each one nibbling away at the state's power to chart its own course. It's a dark irony that institutions like the BIS and IMF, which present themselves as guardians of global financial stability and development, have often been at the center of instability and underdevelopment for many nations. The hidden power structures of global finance, central bankers cloistered in Basel, IMF economists enforcing austerity in world capitals, and covert operatives pulling strings behind coups and crises, have created a system of profound inequality. In this system, economic sovereignty for smaller nations is more notional than real. They operate within parameters set by others, constrained by debt and external dictates. Publicly, we hear of partnership and assistance. Privately, it's about control and leverage. The evidence drawn from history and declassified records is unambiguous. From the BIS enabling Nazi finance to the IMF's willful blindness to the social wreckage it leaves, these institutions have served the interests of a transnational elite first and foremost. Yes, they have prevented some crises, and yes, nations have at times been complicit in their own mismanagement. But the solution offered, perpetual debt and forfeited autonomy, looks awfully like a new form of servitude. It's as if the colonial era's domination was repackaged in the sterile language of loans and reforms. Instead of gunboats and East India companies, we have quarterly reviews and conditionalities. The end result, however, can feel similar to those on the receiving end: loss of land, loss of livelihood, loss of self-determination. Understanding these hidden mechanics is the first step toward change. As citizens, voters, and mere humans trying to earn a decent living, we must stay informed and suspicious about who truly benefits from global financial policies. The next time you hear a technocrat extolling the virtues of an IMF program or a banker rhapsodizing about financial integration, remember the stories of Romania's cold and dark 1980s nights or the bread riots in countries where austerity was medicine. The curtain needs to be pulled back on this global theater. The BIS Tower and the IMF headquarters may seem distant and unimportant to our daily lives, but the decisions made there ripple through our jobs, our grocery bills, and our national futures. The world order of debt is not a natural inevitability. It was constructed, brick by brick, bailout by bailout, often in the shadows. By shining a light on its history and operations, we can start asking the right questions. Whom do these institutions really serve? At what cost? And most importantly, how do we break free? Awakening to this reality is not about indulging in conspiracy theories. It's about recognizing the hard truths of power in the economic realm. Only then can nations and peoples begin to reclaim the agency that has been slowly and subtly siphoned away, and perhaps rewrite the rules of a system that has enslaved far too many in the name of saving them.